Picture this. An army so massive it stretches beyond the horizon, 86,000 soldiers strong, the most colossal military force a republic has ever assembled, marching with one singular purpose: to hunt down and completely annihilate their most hated enemy. But what if I told you that this unstoppable juggernaut would be completely destroyed in just one afternoon? Not defeated, not routed, but systematically devoured in what can only be described as the most perfect military trap ever conceived. This is the spine-chilling tale of how one man's tactical genius turned Rome's mightiest army into prey, trapped in a killing field of his own design. Welcome to the nightmare that was the Battle of Cannae, where military strategy became an art form painted in blood. If this sounds incredible, wait until you hear how it actually happened. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss any detail of this masterclass in military genius. The scorching summer of 216 BC found the Mediterranean world holding its breath. For over 2 agonizing years, a shadow had been cast across the Italian peninsula, a spectre of military genius so profound it seemed almost supernatural. This shadow haunted Roman nightmares, shattered their deeply ingrained sense of invincibility, and threatened the very existence of their republic. His name was Hannibal Barca, and he'd already achieved what the Roman mind considered impossible. This Carthaginian commander, born from a legacy of hatred for Rome, had not only marched his army from Spain, across Gaul, and through the treacherous, frozen passes of the Alps with his entire army, including his terrifying war elephants. He had then proceeded to systematically humiliate the legions of Rome in 2 devastating encounters. A perfectly sprung trap at the Trebia River that ended in a freezing, bloody rout, and a masterful ambush in the morning mists of Lake Trasimene that resulted in the complete annihilation of a consular army and the death of its commander. Rome, the emerging superpower of the ancient world, a nation built on the foundations of martial pride and unwavering self-belief, found itself in an unprecedented crisis. Their traditional military superiority, the very bedrock of their civilization, had not just been questioned, it had been openly mocked. Their Italian territories, which they had spent centuries conquering and securing, were being violated at will, and their pride, the engine of their relentless expansion, was wounded beyond measure. In the wake of the Trasimene disaster, a religious panic gripped the city. The sacred Sibylline books were consulted, human sacrifices were considered, and the people saw ill omens in every flock of birds. Hannibal was no longer just a man. He was a divine punishment, a scourge sent by the gods to test Rome to its breaking point. In response, the Senate had initially turned to a man whose temperament was the complete antithesis of Roman aggression, Quintus Fabius Maximus. Appointed as dictator, Fabius pioneered a new and deeply unpopular strategy. Historians now call it Fabian tactics, a grinding war of attrition that involved avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal at all costs. Fabius's legions would shadow Hannibal's army from the hills, harassing his foraging parties, cutting off his stragglers, and denying him the decisive battle he craved. It was a strategy of patience, a strategy that recognized Hannibal's tactical genius and refused to play his game. It was strategically brilliant, and it was saving Rome. But patience was not a virtue. The Roman people, or their ambitious politicians, possessed in abundance. The sight of an enemy army marching with impunity through their fields and farms was a daily, festering humiliation. Their blood boiled with indignation, their honour demanded satisfaction, and their voices grew louder and more insistent in the forum, calling for a return to the traditional Roman way of war, a single, decisive, glorious battle. The political pressure became unbearable. The cautious wisdom of Fabius was cast aside in favour of a populist hunger for vengeance. And so Rome made a fateful decision that would echo through the corridors of history. They would assemble the largest, most powerful army in their republic's existence, and send it forth with one crystal-clear, unambiguous order: find Hannibal and destroy him utterly. This colossal force would number 8 full legions, supplemented by an equal number of allied troops, creating a war machine of approximately 86,000 men. It was a statement of absolute, overwhelming power, a declaration that Rome's patience had reached its limit, and that its vast reserves of manpower would now be brought to bear to crush this Carthaginian menace once and for all. What they didn't realise, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they were about to walk directly into the most sophisticated and terrifying trap in all of military history, a trap orchestrated by a mind that understood warfare not just as an exercise in brutality, but as a sublime and deadly art form, a symphony of psychology, geography and timing woven together in perfect deadly harmony. Command of this mighty Roman host, the greatest the Republic had ever put into the field, was not given to a single supreme commander like Fabius. Instead, it was divided between the 2 annually elected consuls, a decision born from the very DNA of Roman politics, and one that would prove utterly catastrophic. The Roman system of dual leadership, a brilliant constitutional safeguard designed to prevent any one man from accumulating enough power to become a king, now became a fatal, exploitable weakness. The Republic's fear of tyranny would lead it directly into the jaws of annihilation, especially when, facing a singular genius like Hannibal, who understood how to exploit every political and military vulnerability his opponents possessed. Lucius Aemilius Paullus represented the old guard of the Roman patrician nobility. He was a seasoned, respected, and cautious man, a veteran of previous wars in Illyria, and a politician who had held the consulship before. He possessed the sober wisdom that comes from years of military service and high-stakes political manoeuvring. Paullus was not immune to the desire for glory, but his ambition was tempered by a deep understanding of risk. He knew they were not just fighting an army, they were playing a deadly game against the most brilliant military mind of their age. He had studied Hannibal's previous victories at Trebia and Trasimene, had recognised the terrifying pattern of deception and ambush, and was a firm advocate for continuing the Fabian strategy of caution and delay. In his mind, time was Rome's greatest weapon. Hannibal was an invader operating far from home, with no reliable supply lines, no major port, and no secure base of operations. To engage him on his own terms was madness. The correct strategy, Paullus argued, was to use Rome's overwhelming numbers not for a single, risky battle, but to corner, contain, and slowly strangle Hannibal's army through a war of logistics and attrition. Standing in stark, almost violent contrast was Gaius Terentius Varro. He was a new man, a plebeian who embodied everything dangerous about populist politics combined with high military command. Varro had clawed his way to the consulship not through a distinguished family name or a celebrated military career, but by becoming the mouthpiece for the Roman people's rage and frustration. He stood in the forum and promised them exactly what they wanted to hear. He mocked the caution of Fabius and Paullus as cowardice. He guaranteed a glorious, decisive battle that would not just defeat, but utterly crush the Carthaginian menace once and for all, restoring Roman honour. His rhetoric was intoxicating, his confidence infectious, and, as events would prove, his understanding of military strategy was woefully, catastrophically inadequate. He was the popular will given a sword, a political demagogue placed in command of 86,000 lives. The Roman system, in its flawed wisdom, dictated that these two men, with their diametrically opposed philosophies of war, would alternate supreme command of the army on a daily basis. This created a dangerously schizophrenic leadership structure that swung wildly between Paullus's caution and Varro's aggression. One day, the army would maneuver carefully, seeking high ground and fortified positions. The next, it would march aggressively, seeking immediate confrontation. Hannibal, observing this dysfunctional command from his position in southern Italy, through his network of spies and scouts, must have seen it as a gift from the gods. He recognized it as the perfect opportunity, the central weakness he could manipulate to force his enemies into making the exact mistakes he needed them to make. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian commander was orchestrating a masterpiece of strategic manipulation, playing not on the terrain, but on the very soul of his enemy. Hannibal understood Roman psychology better than many Romans understood themselves. He knew their deep-seated martial pride, their cultural impatience for drawn-out conflicts, their desperate need for a decisive face-to-face victory to erase the shame of his earlier triumphs. Most importantly, he knew their tendency to let raw, collective emotion override cool, strategic thinking. Every move he made from this point forward was not just a military maneuver, it was a calculated psychological prod, a carefully crafted insult designed to inflame their arrogance, bait their aggression, and draw their magnificent but clumsily led army deeper and deeper into a web of their own making. With the massive Roman army now lumbering towards him, Hannibal's next move demonstrated the sophisticated, multi-layered thinking that separated him from ordinary commanders. He understood that the Fabian strategy of avoidance, while politically unpopular in Rome, was still a serious strategic threat to his army's survival. A war of attrition was a war he could not win. He needed to force the decisive battle that Varro craved and Paullus feared, but he needed to do it on his own terms. Rather than waiting passively for the Roman juggernaut to find him, he deliberately marched his army south across the plains of Apulia and seized the town of Cannae. This single action was not a move of desperation. It was a stroke of pure, calculated genius, a strategic masterstroke that achieved multiple critical objectives simultaneously. First, and most immediately, it was a solution to his own pressing logistical nightmare. Operating deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from any friendly Carthaginian supply lines, Hannibal's multi-ethnic army was constantly on the edge of starvation and logistical collapse. The Fabian strategy of scorching the earth and harassing his foraging parties had been brutally effective. The massive grain stores and supply depots located at Cannae, a citadel used by the Romans to provision their own forces in the region, represented a vital lifeline. Capturing them not only provided his own army with desperately needed food and supplies that could keep them fed and fighting for months, but it also denied those same resources to his enemy. Second, and far more importantly, by seizing Cannae, Hannibal placed himself in a position that the Romans simply could not ignore. This was no mere village. It was a crucial strategic supply hub that provisioned Rome's legions and fed its vital allies throughout southeastern Italy. By capturing it, Hannibal was not merely taking supplies for his own army. He was actively threatening the entire network of alliances that formed the very backbone of Roman power in the region. He was demonstrating to Rome's allies that the Republic could no longer protect them, that their granaries and their cities were now at his mercy. He was forcing the Roman Senate and its consuls to act, and to act now, lest their entire confederacy begin to unravel. The specific location Hannibal chose for this provocation was equally calculated and brilliant. The terrain around Cannae was a wide, flat and treeless plain bordered by the Aufidus River. It was, in short, perfect ground for cavalry operations. This was absolutely crucial because Hannibal knew that his single greatest tactical advantage over the Romans lay in his superior mounted forces. His Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry were far better than their Roman counterparts, and his Numidian light cavalry were in a class of their own, the finest mounted skirmishers in the entire Mediterranean world. By positioning himself on ground that maximised the effectiveness of his cavalry, while minimising the manoeuvrability of Rome's superior numbers of heavy infantry, he was not just seizing a town, he was deliberately and masterfully choosing the exact battlefield where the final, decisive encounter would take place. Finally, the psychological aspect of this move was a masterpiece of calculated arrogance. Hannibal was not hiding in the mountains. He was not running from the massive army sent to destroy him. He was not avoiding confrontation. He was standing boldly in the middle of Roman territory, his standards planted defiantly, his army feeding on Roman grain, and he was essentially daring them to come and fight. For a people as proud, as martial, and as honour-bound as the Romans, this level of public, contemptuous defiance was unbearable. It was a direct insult to their imperium, their authority to rule. It was exactly the kind of audacious provocation that would inflame the popular demand for battle, empower the aggressive consul Varro, and drive the Roman army to abandon all caution and seek the immediate, decisive, and ultimately fatal action that Hannibal had so perfectly prepared for them. The trap is being set, but the real genius is yet to come. If you're enjoying this deep dive into ancient military strategy, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video to help others discover this incredible story. The Roman army that marched south toward Cannae was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen before, assembled by a single republic. It was a physical manifestation of Rome's fury and its seemingly limitless reserves of manpower. 8 full legions, double the standard consular army, plus an equal number of allied troops, created a colossal force that dwarfed most entire kingdoms of the era. Each legion was a highly organised professional military unit of approximately 5,000 men, a miniature army in itself, organised with a rigid discipline and armed with the finest equipment Roman industry could produce. This was not just an army. It was a statement, a declaration in steel and sinew that the games were over and the full crushing weight of the Republic was now in motion. The standard Roman legionary was the backbone of this force. He was a citizen soldier, equipped with the iconic panoply of the Republic's wars. He wore a bronze helmet, a pectoral plate or a coat of mail, and carried the large, curved, rectangular shield known as the scutum, which provided excellent protection. His primary weapons were twofold. First was the pilum, a heavy javelin with a long, soft iron shank designed to bend on impact, rendering the enemy's shield useless and the weapon itself unthrowable back at them. After the initial volley of pila, the legionary would draw his primary weapon, the gladius hispaniensis, a short, broad, lethally effective sword designed for the brutal, close-quarters stabbing and thrusting of melee combat. These were not conscripts or foreign mercenaries. They were Romans, men fighting for their homeland, their families, and the survival of their republic. Their training was intensive, their discipline was legendary, and their collective courage, forged in centuries of conquest, was unquestioned. Supporting the core of the Roman legions were the auxiliary troops provided by Rome's Italian allies. These were men from cities and tribes that Rome had conquered but had integrated into its confederation, men who were now bound by treaty to fight for the Republic. They brought specialized skills that the legions often lacked, such as archery from Crete, slinging from the Balearic Islands, and crucially, additional cavalry. The combined force represented not just the military might of the city of Rome itself, but the collective power of the entire Italian Confederation, a system of alliances that Rome had spent centuries painstakingly building and maintaining. It was this system that gave Rome its strategic depth and its ability to absorb horrific losses and still raise new armies. As this massive, magnificent army, a river of 86,000 men, approached Hannibal's position at Cannae, the simmering tension between the two commanding consuls reached a breaking point. The cautious and experienced Lucius Aemilius Paullus, seeing the flat, open terrain that so obviously favoured Hannibal's superior cavalry, continued to advocate for the Fabian strategy. He argued that they should not engage on this ground. Instead, he suggested they should establish a heavily fortified camp on the nearby hills, control the supply lines, and use their overwhelming numerical superiority to create an unassailable position, effectively besieging Hannibal's army and forcing the Carthaginian to either attack them at a severe disadvantage or starve. His strategy was sound, logical, and safe. But Varro, the populist demagogue, was having none of it. He saw Paulus's caution not as wisdom, but as the timid dithering of an out-of-touch aristocrat. The longer they delayed, the more his own political reputation, which was built entirely on the promise of a quick and glorious victory, suffered. He had promised the Roman people a decisive battle, and every day of inaction made him look like a coward or a liar. The political pressure was immense, and Varro was a man who cared more for his public image than for military reality. So, when his day of supreme command arrived on the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, he made the fateful, arrogant, and ultimately catastrophic decision that would doom tens of thousands of Roman soldiers to a horrific and pointless death. He would offer battle here and now on the very ground Hannibal himself had chosen. The Roman battle formation that took shape on that fateful morning was a physical manifestation of Varro's political promises and Rome's core military philosophy, the application of overwhelming brute force at a single, decisive point. Varro, in his arrogant certainty, arranged his 86,000 men in an incredibly deep and dangerously narrow formation. Instead of the standard Roman deployment, which balanced width with depth to maintain flexibility, he packed his infantry maniples, the core tactical units of the legion, much closer together than usual. The result was a colossal, monolithic block of heavy infantry, a formation that was far deeper than it was wide. This was not a line of battle. It was a human battering ram, a concentration of force designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to punch directly through the enemy's centre with an unstoppable, irresistible momentum. The logic behind Varro's deployment was simple, brutal, and on the surface seemingly sound. With such an overwhelming numerical advantage, why bother with complex manoeuvres? Why worry about the flanks? He could create a formation so deep, so dense, and so powerful that no enemy line could possibly withstand its physical and psychological impact. They would advance straight toward what he perceived as the weakest point of Hannibal's army, the Gallic and Spanish infantry in the centre, and break clean through his lines. Once they had shattered the enemy's core, the legions could then pivot and roll up the rest of the Carthaginian forces from the inside out. It was warfare reduced to its most basic and arrogant equation. Mass times velocity equals an unstoppable, battle-winning force. It was a plan that relied on a single, massive hammer blow, with no contingency for what might happen if that blow did not land as expected. The Roman cavalry, always the weakest arm of the Republic's military, was placed on the wings as was traditional. The smaller force of Roman citizen cavalry was positioned on the right flank near the Aufidus River, while the more numerous allied Italian cavalry held the left flank on the open plain. But in Varro's mind, and indeed in the minds of most Roman commanders, their role was secondary. They were there to protect the flanks of the main infantry block and hopefully to chase down the enemy once the battle was won. Everyone understood that this battle, according to the Roman plan, would be decided by the brute force collision of heavy infantry in the centre. The entire Roman strategy relied on two core assumptions: the inherent superiority of their heavy infantry and the overwhelming power of their numerical advantage. They were essentially betting the entire fate of the Republic on a single, massive, head-on charge, a display of pure kinetic energy designed to shatter the Carthaginian army and erase the shame of their previous defeats. It was a plan born of arrogance, impatience, and a profound, fatal underestimation of the mind of their opponent. What faced the advancing Roman juggernaut across the dusty plain was a formation that, to the arrogant eyes of Varro, must have looked almost suicidally confident, a deployment riddled with apparent weaknesses. But this was no mistake. Hannibal had arranged his 50,000 men not just as a line of battle, but as the carefully calibrated mechanism of a giant trap. Every single placement, every angle, every unit's position was calculated with the mathematical precision of a master engineer designing a machine for slaughter. In the very centre of his line, directly in the path of the massive Roman battering ram, Hannibal deliberately placed his weakest and least reliable troops, his Spanish and Gallic infantry. These were brave and ferocious warriors, armed with longswords and fighting in their tribal styles, but they were more lightly armoured and lacked the stoic, grinding discipline of the Roman legionaries. To the Roman commanders studying the enemy formation, this seemed like a gift from the gods, an obvious and glaring weakness that confirmed the wisdom of their plan to punch through the centre. But Hannibal did not arrange these troops in a simple straight line. Instead, with an act of tactical genius, he pushed them forward, far in front of the rest of his army, in a long, shallow, convex crescent. This crescent bulged outwards towards the advancing Romans, creating what appeared to be an aggressive but fragile and easily breakable salient. It was the bait, perfectly presented and utterly irresistible. Hidden from direct view, set back on either side of this sacrificial crescent, were the true anvils of Hannibal's plan, his elite African veterans. These were battle-hardened professionals, the core of the army that had marched with him from Spain. Many were now superbly equipped with the very armour, shields and swords captured from the Romans in his previous victories at Trebia and Trasimene. They were arrayed in deep, solid formations, their flanks refused, angled back from the main line. They were the unshakable walls of the trap, disciplined soldiers who could be trusted to hold their ground and execute complex manoeuvres under the most extreme stress of battle. Their job was not to meet the initial charge, but to wait patiently for the jaws of the trap to close. And on the wings, Hannibal deployed his decisive weapon, the arm of his army that he knew the Romans could not match. On his left wing, facing the weaker Roman citizen cavalry, he placed his superb Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry under the command of his brother Hasdrubal. These were superior horsemen, better trained and more heavily armoured than their Roman counterparts, and their task was simple: to shatter the Roman right wing and then execute a complex battle-winning manoeuvre. On his right wing, facing the more numerous Roman allied cavalry, he deployed his Numidian light cavalry under Hannibal. These were the finest mounted skirmishers in the Mediterranean world, men who rode without saddles or bridles, who could harass an enemy with swarms of javelins and then seemingly vanish, their job not to break the enemy, but to fix them in place and prevent them from interfering. Every single element of this deployment was a carefully calibrated part of a single terrifying machine, designed with one purpose: to create the perfect killing trap. The weak, bulging centre was designed to give way, to bend and then break, drawing the overconfident Roman legions deeper and deeper into a pocket. The strong, refused flanks of African infantry would then hold the Romans in place, preventing them from expanding outwards, and the superior cavalry, having won the battle on the wings, would then seal the trap from behind, ensuring that once the 86,000 men of the Roman army had walked into the killing box, not a single one of them could escape. As dawn broke over the plain of Cannae on that sweltering August morning, the air itself grew thick with a palpable electric tension. It carried the sounds of tens of thousands of men preparing to meet their gods, the rhythmic metallic clatter of armour being fastened, the sharp scraping sound of whetstones being drawn across gladius blades, the low murmur of prayers offered to Jupiter, Mars, Baal Hammon, and 100 other deities. This was the symphony of impending violence, the final, quiet moments before the storm of steel would be unleashed upon the parched earth. When the consul Varro, confident in his plan and his numbers, gave the signal to advance, the Roman legions surged forward with a single thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the plain. This was Roman warfare in its purest, most terrifying form. 86,000 men, a moving city of iron and bronze, advancing in disciplined, almost perfectly synchronized ranks. Their red shields, the scuta, were locked together, a moving wall of imperial power. Their spears bristled over the top, a forest of sharpened iron. The sight of this human juggernaut, this inexorable tide of disciplined fury advancing in unison under 1,000 fluttering standards, must have been both magnificent and utterly terrifying. Their target was the deliberately exposed bulging crescent of Spanish and Gallic warriors in Hannibal's centre. The initial collision was spectacular and brutally violent. The Spanish and Gallic troops, knowing their vital role in their general's plan, met the Roman charge not with a brittle defence, but with a ferocious courage of their own. Steel rang against steel with a deafening clang as the Roman pila slammed into their shields, followed by the horrific grinding sound of the two infantry lines mashing together. Men screamed, fought and died in a chaotic, desperate melee at the point of impact. The fine dust of the Apulian plain, kicked up by the struggle of over 100,000 men, began to rise in great choking clouds that would soon obscure the sun. For the Roman commanders, and for Varro himself, everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned, a perfect validation of their brute force strategy. The enemy centre, just as they had predicted, was buckling under the tremendous, overwhelming pressure of their deep formation. They could see Hannibal's Celtic and Iberian troops being physically pushed backwards, their line bending and giving way. The Romans could feel the undeniable momentum of their massive formation, the sheer kinetic energy of their advance as they drove deeper and deeper into what they believed was a collapsing enemy line. Intoxicated by this apparent success, Varro made a critical decision. He ordered his reserve legions, the Triarii, to move forward from the rear and feed into the centre, adding even more weight to what he was certain was the decisive battle-winning breakthrough. But what the Romans perceived as a glorious victory was, in fact, the beginning of their own destruction. Hannibal, riding along the line behind his troops, was not in a panic. He was in complete control, personally directing the retreat. His centre was not breaking in chaos. It was bending with a carefully controlled, elastic discipline, exactly as he had planned. The convex crescent, the shallow bow that had bulged out towards the Romans, was now slowly, deliberately and inexorably transforming into a concave U-shape. With every step the Romans took forward, they were being drawn deeper and deeper into a pocket, a carefully prepared killing ground of Hannibal's own making. The jaws of the trap were opening, and the Romans, blinded by their arrogance and their apparent success, were marching willingly, even eagerly, into its mouth. While the massive Roman infantry formation pressed forward into what they believed was a collapsing enemy centre, the real, decisive action of the battle, the action that would seal their doom, was taking place on the flanks. On Hannibal's left wing, positioned near the Alfidus River, his superb Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry, under the direct and brilliant command of his brother Asdrubal, spurred their powerful warhorses into a full, thundering charge. They crashed headlong into the much smaller and weaker Roman citizen cavalry force commanded by the consul Paullus himself. What followed was not a contest. It was a swift, brutal, and utterly predictable massacre. Roman cavalry had always been the Achilles heel of their otherwise formidable military system. Rome was an infantry culture. Her sons were trained to fight on their feet as part of a disciplined legion. While wealthy citizens served as cavalry out of duty, they lacked the deep cultural tradition of horsemanship that made mounted forces truly effective. Their horses were often smaller, their training focused on basic maneuvers, and their primary role was often seen as simply protecting the flanks of the all-important infantry. They were amateurs in a professional's game. The Spanish and Gallic cavalry fighting for Hannibal, by contrast, came from warrior cultures where horsemanship was central to their very identity. These men had been riding and fighting from horseback since childhood. Their horses were larger, stronger, and better trained for the shock of combat. Their weapons, like the heavy Gallic longswords and Spanish falcatas, were designed for devastating slashing attacks from a mounted position. Their tactics, refined through generations of tribal warfare, were fluid, aggressive, and perfectly suited for a decisive charge. The collision between these two forces was brief, violent, and decisive. The Roman cavalry line, facing a heavier, more skillful, and more numerous opponent, simply disintegrated on impact. Paullus fought bravely, but his men were overwhelmed. Some were cut down in the initial charge, their lighter armour no match for the heavy blades of the Gauls. The rest were shattered, their formation broken, and the survivors sent fleeing in a complete and panicked rout back towards their own camp. But it was here that Hasdrubal demonstrated the kind of iron discipline and tactical awareness that marked Hannibal's entire army. A lesser commander would have allowed his men to give in to the intoxicating thrill of the chase, pursuing the fleeing Romans for miles and effectively taking themselves out of the main battle. Hasdrubal, however, acting on Hannibal's precise instructions, did not. He halted the pursuit, rallied his victorious and bloodthirsty cavalrymen, and led them on a sweeping, disciplined charge across the entire rear of the Roman army. This brilliant manoeuvre showcased the sophisticated level of tactical coordination that Hannibal had achieved with his multi-ethnic force. While Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry was destroying its immediate opponent, the other wing of Hannibal's cavalry, his famed Numidian light horsemen under Maharbal, was engaged in a completely different but equally important action. On the open plain of the right flank, they were facing the more numerous Roman allied cavalry. The Numidians were masters of mounted warfare, but their strength lay in harassment and mobility, not direct heavy confrontation. For the entire opening phase of the battle, they'd been executing a brilliant tactical dance, charging in to throw javelins, feigning retreats to draw the Romans out of position, and then vanishing in a cloud of dust, always refusing a decisive head-on engagement. They were a swarm of deadly hornets, keeping the larger Roman allied cavalry force completely occupied, confused, and unable to intervene in the main infantry battle. It was into the rear of this frustrated and disorganized Roman allied cavalry that Hasdrubal's victorious heavy cavalry now slammed like an iron fist. The effect was devastating. Attacked from the front by the swirling elusive Numidians and now crushed from behind by the irresistible charge of Hasdrubal's heavy horse, the second Roman cavalry wing disintegrated completely. Some fled the field, others were cut down where they stood, and the few survivors found themselves scattered, leaderless, and completely ineffective. In the space of perhaps less than an hour, through a perfect combination of a brute force charge and a brilliant holding action, Hannibal had achieved complete and total cavalry superiority across the entire battlefield. The wings of death were now free to do their work. With the Roman cavalry completely swept from the field, the stage was now set for the final, horrifying act of Hannibal's tactical masterpiece. The Roman legions, having triumphantly pushed what they thought was the Carthaginian centre for nearly half a mile, now found themselves in an extremely dangerous and exposed position. Their relentless forward advance had caused their deep formation to become even more compressed and tightly packed. Their flanks, once protected by cavalry, were now completely naked, and their forward momentum, the very engine of their strategy, was beginning to slow as they encountered the stiffer, rallying resistance of the Spanish and Gallic troops who had successfully completed their feigned retreat. At this crucial, perfectly timed moment, Hannibal gave the signal his army had been waiting for. From his vantage point he saw his crescent had bent to its breaking point, and the Roman legions were now fully committed and deep within the pocket. The signal, perhaps a horn blast or a single raised standard, went out. On both wings of the Carthaginian line, his elite African infantry, who had been held patiently in reserve throughout the entire battle, now executed their deadly preordained maneuver. With the discipline of veteran professionals, they wheeled inward 90 degrees, their formations pivoting like the closing jaws of some enormous, perfectly engineered predator. These disciplined veterans, many of them ironically wearing the superior mail armour and carrying the scuta captured from the Romans in previous victories, slammed with devastating force into the vulnerable, exposed sides of the deep Roman formations. The effect was catastrophic and immediate for the Romans. Their entire tactical system, the very foundation of their military success, was built around frontal combat. The legion was designed to be an unbreakable wall to the front, with its strength and cohesion directed forward. They had no adequate training, no doctrine, and no effective response for a sudden, powerful, and simultaneous assault from multiple directions. The men on the outer flanks of the massive formation, who had been marching forward moments before, suddenly found themselves under a ferocious assault from an unexpected quarter. They were forced to try and turn outwards to defend themselves a near impossible task in the tightly packed ranks. This created a nightmarish, fatal paradox within the Roman formation. The men on the flanks, now desperately trying to give ground and face the new threat, were being physically pushed forward by the thousands of men in the centre and rear ranks. These soldiers, unable to see what was happening on the periphery and still focused on their original objective of breaking the centre, continued to surge forward. This created an unimaginable internal pressure, a horrific situation where different parts of the Roman army were trying to move in opposite directions simultaneously. The careful discipline of the legions, their greatest strength, began to catastrophically break down as confusion, fear, and contradictory orders spread through the ranks. Then, as the Roman formation began to dissolve into a compressed, panicked mob, Hannibal unleashed the final devastating blow. Hasdrubal, his brilliant brother, having completed the destruction of both Roman cavalry wings, had rallied his victorious heavy cavalry. Now, operating with complete freedom of movement and with no one left to oppose them, these mounted warriors, flush with victory, charged with thunderous force into the completely exposed rear of the Roman infantry formations. The encirclement was now absolute. The largest and proudest army Rome had ever fielded found itself surrounded on all four sides by enemies who now held every conceivable advantage: superior position, complete freedom of movement, and the terrifying psychological momentum of a perfectly executed plan. The great Roman battering ram had not broken through the Carthaginian line. It had been drawn into a meticulously constructed Carthaginian killing box, a trap from which there was now absolutely no escape. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a methodical, industrial-scale massacre that would be burned into the Roman psyche for generations, a national trauma from which they would never fully recover. Trapped in a shrinking, suffocating pocket, packed shoulder to shoulder so tightly that they were unable to properly maneuver, unable even to find enough room to effectively swing their gladius swords, the Roman soldiers were systematically annihilated. The Carthaginian circle of death grew smaller and tighter, a relentless, grinding process of extermination. The dust kicked up by the struggle of tens of thousands of dying men rose in great thick clouds that blotted out the afternoon sun, transforming the battlefield into a hellish, claustrophobic cauldron of semi-darkness. The air, thick and choking, filled with the cacophony of slaughter. The high-pitched screams of pain and terror, the guttural war cries of the Carthaginians, the endless rhythmic clang of steel on armour, and the sickening wet sounds of blades cutting through flesh and bone. Men were not just killed by the enemy. They were trampled to death by their own comrades, suffocated in the sheer unbearable press of panicked bodies, or cut down by enemies they could barely see through the swirling blood-red dust. The vaunted Roman formations, once the pride of military engineering and the instrument of their conquests, now became their death traps. The men in the centre of the formation, who had charged forward so confidently, now found themselves unable to move forward or backward, helplessly pushed from behind into the waiting spears of the African infantry, while being simultaneously attacked from all sides. Those on the periphery, the outer layers of the doomed mass, faced an impossible, agonizing choice. Try to fight enemies they couldn't properly engage, or be crushed to death by the sheer weight of their own retreating, panicking comrades. It was a perfect storm of death, a tactical nightmare from which there was no awakening. Amidst the carnage, the consul Lucius Aemilius Paullus, the experienced and cautious commander who had warned against this very scenario, fought with the desperate courage of a true Roman aristocrat. Unhorsed and bleeding from a slingshot wound to the head, he continued to fight on foot among his men, trying to rally them even as the last hope of survival faded. According to the historian Livy, a military tribune found him sitting on his stone covered in blood and offered him his horse to escape the carnage. But Paullus, knowing the cause was lost and refusing to abandon his soldiers to a fate he'd tried to prevent, ordered the young man to save himself. He chose to die with his army, a final tragic act of honour. He was last seen in the thickest part of the slaughter, fighting bravely until the very end. His body, like those of 80 senators who had served with him, lost among the mountains of the slain. His arrogant colleague Varro, in a final act of ignominy, managed to cut his way out with a small group of cavalry and escape the disaster he had created. The slaughter continued for hours, a relentless grinding process that lasted throughout the long, hot afternoon. Roman soldiers, trained to fight as part of a cohesive unit and dependent on mutual support, found themselves isolated, surrounded and helpless. Individual acts of incredible courage and sheer, desperate survival played out across the blood-soaked field. But the outcome had been decided by strategy long before personal bravery could influence the result. As the Carthaginian circle tightened, the last pockets of resistance were snuffed out. By sunset, the sounds of battle finally died away, replaced by a ghastly silence, broken only by the moans of the dying. Somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000, Roman soldiers and their allies lay dead or dying on the plain of Cannae. It was the single worst military disaster in Roman history, a defeat so complete, so numerically staggering, and so tactically humiliating that it redefined what the Romans thought as possible in warfare. Hannibal's perfect trap had not just defeated an army, it had bled a generation of the Roman Republic dry in a single afternoon. As Hannibal's exhausted but triumphant army surveyed the almost unimaginable field of carnage, the true, terrifying magnitude of what they had accomplished began to sink in. This had not been a battle in the traditional sense. It had been a perfect, clinical, and utterly devastating demonstration of military genius operating at the highest conceivable level. Every single element of the engagement, from the very first feigned retreat of his centre to the final crushing charge of his cavalry, had gone exactly according to Hannibal's intricate and brilliant plan. He had not just defeated the largest army Rome had ever fielded, he had led it by the nose into a trap of his own design and systematically annihilated it. One of Hannibal's most aggressive cavalry commanders, Hannibal, the leader of the brilliant Numidian horsemen, rode with his general to the edge of a small hill overlooking the sea of Roman dead. Intoxicated by the sheer scale of the victory, Hannibal saw a singular golden opportunity that transcended the immediate battlefield. According to historical accounts, he turned to his general, his eyes blazing with victorious fire, and urged immediate decisive action. "Send me forward with the cavalry," he implored, "and follow with the infantry. Give me 5 days, and I will be dining on the Capitoline Hill in Rome." The suggestion was bold, electrifying, and on the surface perfectly logical. Rome's main army was gone. The road to the capital lay open and practically defenceless. The city itself was surely in a state of absolute paralysing panic. This was the moment to strike the final, killing blow. But Hannibal, standing amidst the proof of his perfect victory, hesitated. And this hesitation, this single quiet moment of inaction, has become one of the most furiously debated and analysed decisions in all of military history. Why? Why did the victor of Cannae, the man who had brought Rome to its knees, not march immediately on the city and end the war? Hannibal, in his frustration, is said to have uttered the famous damning words, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Was this a fatal error of judgment, a catastrophic failure of nerve at the crucial moment? The answer, as is often the case with Hannibal, reveals the sophisticated, multi-layered strategic thinking that had made his victory possible in the first place. Hannibal, unlike Hannibal, understood that his ultimate objective was not the physical destruction of the city of Rome, but the political collapse of Roman power in Italy. His entire grand strategy, the very reason he had invaded Italy, was based on dismantling Rome's confederation, on convincing Rome's Italian allies to abandon their allegiance and join the Carthaginian cause. The devastating victory at Cannae was not meant to be a prelude to a siege, but rather the final, irrefutable proof to these allies that Rome was no longer invincible, that her protection was an illusion, and that their future would be better served by switching sides to the new, dominant power on the peninsula. An immediate march on Rome, he believed, was not necessary. The political fallout from Cannae would achieve his strategic goals for him. Moreover, Hannibal was a realist as well as a genius. He knew that his army, despite its stunning victory, was in no condition for a prolonged, difficult siege. His men were utterly exhausted from the brutal battle. They had suffered significant casualties of their own, particularly in the brave Gallic and Spanish centre. And most critically, he lacked the massive specialised siege engines, the catapults, the ballistae, the siege towers that would be absolutely necessary to breach the formidable Servian walls of a city as large and well fortified as Rome. He knew the remaining population of Rome, including old men and boys, would fight with the desperate courage of cornered animals, turning any siege into a long, bloody and uncertain affair. The Carthaginian commander was capable of recognizing the limits of his own capabilities, even in the intoxicating flush of his greatest triumph. He had won the perfect battle. He would not now gamble that victory on a strategically questionable siege. When the first dust-streaked messengers, their faces masks of pale terror, galloped through the gates of Rome, they brought with them a darkness that would plunge the city into its deepest moment of crisis. The news of the disaster at Cannae was so complete, so apocalyptically bad, that many senators and citizens initially refused to believe it. It had to be an exaggeration, a panicked rumour. But as more survivors trickled in, each telling the same horrifying story of a perfect encirclement and a total slaughter, the terrible truth began to sink in. 86,000 men had marched out. The flower of Roman youth, an entire generation of its finest soldiers, its bravest officers, and 80 men of senatorial rank had been annihilated in a single, brutal afternoon. In a city where every citizen was connected to the army, there was not a single family, from the highest patrician household to the lowliest plebeian tenement, that was not touched by the loss. Families throughout the city waited in a state of agonizing suspense for news of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. Any lesser state, any other city or kingdom in the ancient world, would have collapsed under the weight of such a catastrophic blow. The logical, rational response would have been immediate surrender. Hannibal was now the undisputed master of Italy. The path to Rome was open, and the city's last great army was a field of corpses. The only sensible course of action was to send envoys, to negotiate for the best possible terms, and to accept Carthaginian dominance over the Mediterranean. But Rome was not a lesser state. And in this moment of ultimate crisis, this darkest of hours, the Romans revealed the core characteristic that would eventually make them masters of the Mediterranean world, an unbreakable, stubborn, almost irrational resolve. The Senate, led by the few remaining elder statesmen like Fabius Maximus, acted with a speed and ferocity born of pure desperation. When Hannibal, following Carthaginian tradition, sent a delegation of captured Roman nobles to negotiate a ransom for his thousands of prisoners, the Senate, in a display of shocking and brutal resolve, refused to even receive his envoys. They publicly declared that Rome did not negotiate with invaders on its soil, and they left their own captured citizens to their fate. A clear and chilling message to Hannibal and to the world that there would be no terms, no treaty, only total victory or total annihilation. Public mourning was officially forbidden. The wails of grieving women confined to the insides of their homes, lest the city's morale collapse completely. Instead of debating surrender, the Senate immediately began the impossible process of raising new legions from the ashes of the old. They lowered the recruitment age, calling up 17-year-old boys. They raised property taxes to unprecedented levels and requisitioned personal wealth for the war effort. Most shockingly, in a complete break with their proud tradition of a citizen-only army, they enlisted thousands of debtors, criminals, and even slaves, promising them freedom in exchange for service. The entire society mobilized for what they now understood would be a fight to the absolute death. This almost superhuman Roman response demonstrated something that Hannibal, for all his brilliant psychological insight, had perhaps fatally underestimated. He understood how to break a Roman army, but he did not fully understand how to break Roman society. Carthaginian culture, and indeed most cultures of the time, was built around the genius of individual leaders and the success of professional armies. Roman culture, by contrast, was built around the concepts of collective endurance, civic duty, and an almost fanatical institutional resilience. They could absorb devastating, unimaginable losses and continue fighting, not because they were always tactically superior, but because their entire society, their very identity, was organized around the fundamental, unshakable concept of never, ever surrendering. Hannibal had won the battle, but now he was faced with the daunting prospect of fighting an entire civilization that simply refused to accept that it had been beaten. The Battle of Cannae has echoed through military history for over 2 millennia, its name becoming a byword for the perfect battle, a chilling and revered monument to tactical perfection. It is studied with awe in the war colleges of every major military power on earth, its intricate maneuvers referenced by generals and armchair strategists facing their own tactical challenges. Hannibal's double envelopment, the systematic and total destruction of a numerically superior enemy through a masterful combination of deception, superior positioning, and flawless timing, became the gold standard for tactical excellence, the dream of every great commander. The very word Cannae entered the military lexicon as a term for a battle of complete annihilation, achieved through encirclement. Military theorists from the Roman Scipio Africanus, who would later use Hannibal's own lessons against him, to the strategists of the Byzantine Empire, to the great captains of the modern era like Frederick the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, have all analysed and reanalyzed the battle, seeking to understand the intricate clockwork of how such a complete and devastating victory was achieved. The German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, architect of the famous Schlieffen Plan before World War I, was obsessed with Cannae, seeing it as the ultimate blueprint for a decisive battle of encirclement. The engagement demonstrates timeless, universal principles that remain brutally relevant today. The critical importance of understanding and exploiting your enemy's psychology, the power of superior positioning and maneuver over sheer brute force numbers, and the devastating, morale-shattering effect of a coordinated, multi-directional attack. But the legacy of Cannae is a dual one. For all its tactical brilliance, it also illustrates the profound and tragic limitations of that brilliance when it is not supported by a winning grand strategy. Hannibal's perfect trap, his masterpiece of the battlefield, destroyed a Roman army but could not destroy the Roman Republic. His inability to follow up his victory with a successful siege of Rome, and his ultimate failure to break the core of the Roman Confederation, meant that his tactical genius was ultimately overcome by Roman strategic persistence. The Romans lost the battle, but their ability to absorb staggering losses, to raise new armies, and to continue fighting a brutal war of attrition until their enemies were exhausted, ultimately won them the war. Cannae is, therefore, both a celebration of what a single brilliant mind can achieve on the battlefield and a grim cautionary tale that teaches us that battles, no matter how spectacular, do not win wars on their own. Victory requires not just a perfect trap but a strategic vision that can capitalize on that victory to achieve a final, lasting political outcome, a final step that Hannibal, for all his genius, was never able to take. The dusty plain of Cannae stands today as a silent, sun-baked monument to both the heights of military genius and the depths of human tragedy. On that single, sweltering August day in 216 BC, Hannibal Barca, the son of Carthage, demonstrated what was possible when tactical brilliance, profound psychological insight, and flawless execution are combined in a perfect, deadly harmony. His trap at Cannae was so perfectly conceived, so meticulously prepared, and so ruthlessly executed that it has become the benchmark against which all other battles of annihilation are measured, a name that still sends a chill down the spine of military historians. It was, in every sense, the perfect victory. But perhaps the most fascinating and enduring aspect of this story is not just the tactical masterstroke itself, but what it reveals about the fundamental nature of war, power, and civilization. In that single afternoon, Hannibal proved a set of timeless truths: that numerical superiority can mean nothing when confronted with superior strategy, that the arrogance and overconfidence of a commander can be a more dangerous weapon than any sword or spear in the enemy's hands, and that sometimes the most devastating and inescapable traps are the ones we walk into with our eyes wide open, blinded by our own pride and our desperate desire for a quick and glorious victory. Yet, the story of Cannae is a dual-edged sword. For as much as it demonstrated the power of individual genius, it also revealed the incredible, almost superhuman resilience of institutions and cultures that refused to accept defeat. Rome's response to the catastrophe, their stubborn, almost irrational refusal to surrender despite overwhelming evidence that they had been outmatched tactically, militarily, and intellectually, ultimately proved more decisive in the long run than Hannibal's genius. In the great grinding calculus of history, the ability of a civilization to endure a disaster sometimes matters more than the ability of a general to create one. Rome lost the battle in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, but in doing so they learned the hard lessons that would allow them to win the war and ultimately the world. As you think about this incredible story of strategy and slaughter, consider the timeless lessons it offers about leadership, preparation, and the dangerous, intoxicating seduction of overconfidence. Hannibal's victory at Cannae was not just a military triumph, it was a masterclass in understanding human nature in exploiting the psychological weaknesses of an opponent, and in executing complex high-stakes plans under the most extreme pressure. It is a story that reminds us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a collection of human choices, human failures, and moments of human genius that echo through the ages, continuing to teach and to warn us even today. What do you think? Should Hannibal have marched on Rome immediately after Cannae? Could he have ended the war right there, or was his decision to hesitate actually strategically sound? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this deep dive into ancient military genius as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic tales from history. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming strength, but from understanding exactly when and how to spring the perfect trap.